The news is here. Very important 4 words that we heard from this judge presiding over Donald Trump's criminal trial. We have our jury. That's today, and it's actually faster than many expected, and we'll get into why, but those words have legal force. That's not an observation, it's not a commentary, it's not an op-ed in a newspaper about the trial. It is the presiding judge formalizing that they have gone through the process with total fairness to the defendant, even losing some jurors, which I can tell you about today as well, but we have our jury. That's after just 3 days of jury selection. 12 New Yorkers are now on this jury sworn in to decide the fate of Donald Trump. And I can tell you as a legal fact that these 12 people will hear the evidence and then make a decision. And if one of them becomes somehow unavailable or unable to continue their duties, an alternate will step up into that box of 12 and continue on. There are precedents and practices here, which is why they have substitutes. They've been through this before. It's not just 12, and if somebody goes away, it falls apart. Indeed, tomorrow they're going to pick the rest of these alternates for however long that takes, a day or 2 or 3, but it shouldn't take all that long on this pace. 5 women, 7 men in the 12. We do know their professions: an investment banker, a speech therapist, an engineer. And for privacy and legal reasons, we're not disclosing additional information about these individuals. That's why, as well, you see, obviously, anonymous jurors here up on the screen. Now, they were selected out of a pool that could get as large as it needed, but initially began with about 200 New Yorkers who went through the first phase of this process. The defendant looked on as these jurors were questioned and challenged about anything that could create the kind of bias or impartiality that would have them removed. Now, today also began with a bit of a shakeup because 2 people who were just recently this week seated as jurors were dismissed, each for different reasons. The DA, that's the prosecution side, raised questions about how one had a prior arrest. We'll return to that. Today alone, half of the 96 potential jurors were excused after acknowledging they could not be impartial. Now, we have word on one of them. A reporter caught up with 2 of them, actually, outside the courthouse.
It's a historical case, and, you know, this is going to define so many things. But at the same time, our job as a juror, right, is to be impartial, like to be unbiased.
There's no way after my online presence, where I've satirized this man again and again, that I would be fit to, they would regard me as to be fit to serve.
That's one New Yorker saying that he satirized Donald Trump online. That's public. The internet lives forever, if you've heard the term. And so now, in what is certainly an unforeseeable surprise event for him, if you told that man, or any of these jurors probably, in, say, 2017, that what you're typing right now in the middle of the night or in frustration or in reaction to the world's news will be used against you in a court of law, so to speak, not to say that you're a criminal, but to say that you're not fit for the jury. As he said, they could not consider him impartial based on what he had written, said, and implied about Donald Trump online. And that is as it should be. If someone has so publicly or vehemently committed to a position or a criticism that is adverse to impartiality in this process, then they're not the one. They only need 12 jurors and a couple more alternates, as I mentioned, so they can afford to be very picky. And that is, again, in fairness to the defendant, because the burden is on the prosecution. The jurors answered the same 40-plus questions, including whether they'd ever attended a Trump rally, read his books, listened to Michael Cohen's podcast. A juror candidate who was not selected was asked if conversations with coworkers about this very case could influence her. And she first said she could try to be fair, but she also said this, what you see on your screen, quote, "It is hard to unring a bell." In other words, she'd try to be fair, but the bell had been rung on her views on this case, and so she was also not picked. Another juror, though, today was dismissed because, having been sworn in and then tasting or having a little bit of the kind of public reaction that you can get, even if you're imagining it because you say, well, I'm one of the jurors, or people around you start to bring things up. They may or may not know you're a juror, but all that, just in week 1 from all the media, made her say she was concerned about continuing on and concerned about her and her family's safety. She told the court, I have concerns now. The aspects of my identity have already been out there in public. I had friends, colleagues, and family push things to my phone regarding questioning my identity as a juror. I want to be very careful here. That is her view. You might call it her subjective experience or her opinion. You could imagine a different person in New York being asked, are you a juror because of information out there? And that doesn't mean they're in danger. It just means people are all processing some of the same information. Having said that, as fairly as I can, there is a context to this, and it is concerning. Her dismissal came after these kind of statements and coverage, which may be protected by the First Amendment, but still has repercussions about this new jury.
She gets her news from the New York Times, Google, and CNN. She said two things that really stuck out. One, quote, I don't really have an opinion of Trump, and, quote, no one is above the law. I'm not so sure about juror number 2. The fate of a billionaire real estate tycoon, TV celebrity turned 45th president of the United States is in the hands of New York City lawyers, teachers, and Disney workers who like to dance and get their news from the Times, but swear they can be impartial.
That is that individual, that member of the media's view. Now, there's nothing in that clip I just showed you that is illegal or that would be suppressed. It might be disagreeable, it might be misleading, and it might, combined with other things, create an environment that is undermining rather than supporting a fair and impartial process. And by the way, that's hypocritical, because if those folks are so concerned about this process, they should want a fair, reasoned, sober one so that we get to the right answer, which could be the acquittal of these charges, right? That's what a fair process could result in. But if you notice I'm being very careful, it's for a reason. No law was broken with that commentary. And there are people who are going to weigh in on this trial, including various aspects of the process and the jurors. Now, the judge decides the law in this case, and the jury decides the facts. And so I'm going to read to you what the judge said today for further context. Quote, we just lost what would have been a very good juror for this case. She said she was afraid and intimidated by the press. So that's the lay of the land. The judge has now tightened restrictions even further on different things that the press can report about prospective jurors. But again, the fact that a member of the media, in that case a Fox News anchor, used that information the way he chose to, doesn't resolve the tougher questions here, because you can restrict certain information in the court, certainly for safety, certainly for the jurors' anonymity, but this is still going to be a freewheeling debate, and people are going to say things about this trial, and there has to be First Amendment protection for that. And as I've told you before, that means including and especially the things you disagree with, not just the things you agree with. So that's what the judge said. I told you the other thing. Prosecutors also allege that Donald Trump has been violating his gag order. That came up earlier this week. They now cite 7 other instances, including Trump posting online with a quote from that Fox host I just showed you, saying that liberal activists were also somehow lying to get on the jury. Now, Trump is sort of using Fox in a dance to try to get away with saying things. And let me be very clear. Trump, the defendant, is not like just some freewheeling member of the press. He already has restrictions, including a gag order. So it's very different when he does things about the jury or witnesses than others. For example, on this program, we are going to discuss and even at times fact check the witnesses. We can do that. The defendant can't. Now, the prosecutor said that post that I'm leaving up on the screen there was the most disturbing post, especially in light of what happened this morning. Now, Trump's defense lawyers say, quote, none of that established that there's a willful violation. In fact, it brings to light some of the ambiguities of the gag order that I mentioned. Now, here's what the gag order states. The defendant, Trump, is directed to refrain from making or directing others to make public statements about any prospective juror or any juror in this criminal proceeding. So, if you want me to boil it down, you say, okay, Ari, this seems like it's getting a little detailed and technical. Yeah, well, it is technical. We're talking about very specific trial rules. If you want to boil it down, the anchor probably was fine making that statement. I certainly don't think there's going to be a case opened about it. And the defendant, based on the plain text of the gag order, probably was not. That's the legal issue. Again, separate from the opinion of you can criticize both statements. But Trump trying to hide behind the media and saying, oh, I'm just retweeting, I'm just reposting. No, you're doing it, And the gag order very clearly says you can't talk about these jurors or prospective jurors. Now, the judge did not rule on this. There is a previously scheduled hearing Tuesday on the gag order, and we expect all of this stuff, these new clashes, to be included in that hearing. Nothing about this is very typical, although the precedents and the rules apply. It's a high-profile case. A former president is the defendant, and all of this shows the kind of challenges we're up against. With that in mind, there are aspects of this that are legal specific to New York, but that are also public and political.
The jurors you have to worry about are the ones who are sort of Trojan horse jurors, or the ones who are hiding bias. Those are the ones you have to worry about, that they're so motivated by their dislike for Trump that they're willing to lie on the stand.
That's one legal analyst there discussing possible things Trump and others might be worried about. That was on Fox News. We're joined by a very special panel. Former RNC chair and MSNBC host Michael Steele, Reverend Al Sharpton, host of MSNBC's Politics Nation, and a former assistant district attorney for the Manhattan DA's office, Catherine Christian. Welcome to each of you. Nice to see you all.
It's good to see you, man.
It's a good panel, substantively, just arrayed here. I want to start with you on the legalities. Plenty of people say, gosh, that anchor and what they're doing over there is misleading, etc. But real quick on that before we get to the defendant, they can talk like that about most of the trial, right?
They can talk about it. They have no gag order. Only Donald Trump is the one who can't speak about that.
Yeah. And so while we can do media criticism, Al Sharpton's been known to give his views to some of the people over there. Before we do that, I just want to establish that legally there's not an issue for them, even when it's misleading and we might criticize it.
Correct.
But this defendant seems to think if he can quote it or associate it with them, that somehow he's not bound by the gag order. Tell us about that and how that's going to fly, given that you've been in this very courtroom.
I think Donald Trump has violated the gag order. I think the prosecutor today, Chris Conroy, said multiple times is getting ridiculous. And I quite frankly don't understand why Judge Merchan hasn't at a minimum admonished him or reminded him, sir, you realize there's a gag order, to put off the hearing on whether or not he's violated to next week. I don't understand why because that gives Donald Trump the whole weekend to say, I guess I can keep doing this because the judge didn't say anything to me.
You're saying in the lack of a hearing that draws the line, the defendant sees that as a chance to misbehave more.
Or even an admonishment. We're going to have a hearing next week, Mr. Trump, but right now I'm telling you, we have a gag order, don't violate. That hasn't even happened.
Yeah. So then I take it to Al Sharpton. You know your way around New York, the particular media environment, and how Donald Trump has navigated this. He's not being completely reckless or what his supporters would call brave, by which I mean he's not just sounding off. He keeps testing, right? He used the Fox thing to try to say, well, I'm just sharing what's out there. What do you think of his tactics, and how do you think this will play out in New York, arena you know well?
I think that he's being very strategic, which Donald Trump is always strategic in terms of himself. I think he's testing it, you used the right word, Ari, to see how far he can go, because he's trying to poke the judge in hopes of if he has to have an appeal, he can make the judge overreact. So he wants to poke him, hoping that the judge will overreact and come down heavy on him, heavier than what should be done. So that's part of the appeal. He's always got something up his sleeve. He wants to provoke something. He's going to use Fox News as the backboard for him to score with the basket. That's his gameplay. And I think that we'll see if the judge is not going to be baited, but the judge needs to not date it. He needs to just enforce the law.
It's funny you mentioned
the other thing the judge is doing that he better be careful of is if he lets Trump go as far as he's going, how do you come down on somebody else later and say, we gave you a gag order? They can use the Trump rule and say, wait a minute.
Right, it's a new precedent. It's funny you mentioned that kind of basketball shot, because I'm not a big sports guy, but I think that's called a bank shot, and he's had a lot of trouble getting banks to pay his other legal costs. So that's maybe the only kind of bank he knows how to work with.
The only kind of bank he's ever been accused of working with is scheming and trying to get somebody over. He certainly has never been accused of paying his debts or taking care of his bank loans.
Yes. So, Michael Steele, I want to bring you in and play something we excerpted from his remarks today.
Okay.
This is something that does not contain a blatant lie or a violation of the gag order, but in the spirit of covering this case, we picked this part, one, because it's his efforts to defend himself, which he may do, and two, because it does seem a little desperate even for him. He kind of came out of court with a large stack of papers, and you might say, oh, does he have the evidence? Has he been reading through this stuff? You know, court's full of paper evidence.
Full of paper.
But what it is was what appeared to be just printouts that his aides made for him of right-wing and other sites just criticizing and doing opinion. And I thought this juxtaposition was interesting, Michael, because that can work sometimes on the campaign trail or in a Republican primary. That's not how this case is going to be resolved inside that courtroom. Take a look.
Right.
These are all stories. This is over the last few days from legal experts. This is Wall Street Journal editorial. But all of these are stories from legal experts saying how this is not a case. The case is ridiculous. This is another one. The case is a ridiculous Trump indictment. But take a look at all of these are stories. You see them here.
That's Trump. You know, every corner that he's standing on is a stage, and he will use props. He will use whatever tool is available to him to create a narrative that he thinks best A, positions him, and B, allows him to get away with stuff that other people ordinarily wouldn't get away with. I think this, Rev, you know this to be true about Trump. He will always do the thing he wants to do until someone stops him. And he doesn't believe anyone can stop him. And to this point, he's been right. In large measure, he's gotten away with pretty much everything he's attempted to do. He wanted to slow down the trials. Guess what? He slowed down the trials. So now he's got this platform in which he's out here with a stack of papers. We don't know what's in those papers, but he's just telling us what they say and what they are. And that establishes the ongoing narrative, placing him as a victim, and that everyone who believes he's a victim thinks that this trial is wrong or is illegal or is improper, all of that. And that feeds the beast out on the street. And that's ultimately the court of public opinion that he's more interested in than the public opinion, if you will, of a jury or the judge.
And I think that he is playing to that crowd that he wants to keep loyal and hoping that this jury somehow would be mesmerized by just his presence because he's that much of a narcissist. And but that's why he also knows, like in New York, we used to fight. I marched on him and all that. He doesn't like people that'll fight back because, like, when he's saying the judge won't even let me go to my son's graduation, and I would have said, is that the kid that your wife was having when you were going out with the porn star? I mean, is that kid now 18? It would totally rattle him. He likes to go where he's the only one throwing stuff. He can't take a punch back.
Hey, everyone. MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.